One amongst the many ways that I could describe my experience of the human condition at this point is a rhythmic movement between perceived clarity and what I'll call disruption, or an emergence of circumstances on my screen of experience characterized by frustration, tension, uncertainty. From a limited, constricted viewpoint, disruption could be called unpreferable. From an expansion of consciousness, though, this disruptive experience is welcome, as it includes inevitably all that it implies, or an augmentation of texture and richness in the movement of pulsing toward clarity, or further expansion of consciousness. Any access that I've opened to myself at this point to a calm, steady joy and equanimity has been through refraining from resisting the pulsing between perceived clarity and disruption. In so doing, I'm identifying more and more with residence in a more timeless space, a vantage point from which I may observe the pulsing, the rhythm, and enjoy its music. About a decade and a half ago, imagery began to take root in my mind. I began to visualize a collective soul that we all shared, from which we sourced our energy. And as I've read through the works of Alan Watts and other scholars in this field, this imagery has crystallized. As I read Alan Watts' The Supreme Identity, I visualize the infinite as an eternal stream beyond the comprehension of dualistic thought form, from which nodes of sensitivity emerge in mechanical finite form, the human condition. Without further ado, I'll move toward today's readings. Enjoy.
Page 49. For purposes of generating the finite world, the ultimate reality has, as it were, the power of restricting its own knowledge, of becoming finite. Omniscience must mean that the infinite knows every single object simultaneously. It will furthermore know each object with its entire self, as if each object were the one and only thing to be known. Because our consciousness can attend to only one thing at a time, such a state of affairs is as far beyond imagination as anything could be.
Page 67. Just because the infinite is an essence other than the finite, there's not the least need for it to insist on or cling to its own unique position. Without ceasing, then, to be infinite in the least degree, it manifests the finite universe by imagining itself to be every single finite object, by an abandoned and wholly unreserved absorption of itself in the life of everything that lives. Likewise, a mere reflecting red at once becomes red and, at the same time, remains essentially silver or colorless.
Page 77. Is there indeed any real difference between saying on the one hand that after death I'm born again with no memory of the past, or, on the other hand, that after my death another person is born? Is there any real difference between my conscious self and anyone else's? Or is the difference simply that there is but one conscious self taking innumerable different points of view? Skipping down here. If the sense of a selfhood independent of the body is a mere chemical illusion, what makes the very opinion that this is so any less of an illusion?
Page 78. The conscious self transcends thought, but it cannot fully reconstruct itself or its knowledge of thought in terms of thought, just as an artist cannot reconstruct himself or his full understanding of art upon canvas, because then the conscious self is beyond the reach of rational analysis. It is really absurd not to accept its basic intuitions without quibble, as if they were the most certain kind of knowledge that we have. Page 82. In common speech we say, I'm afraid, whereas a more introspective language would say, I'm aware of a fear. Because of this general and habitual confusion
of psychic experience with the conscious self, any suggestion that the self is divine would give the impression of saying that the individual soul is God, which is obviously absurd. Thus, the identification of spirit with soul in theology reflects the common state of the human mind, and the very function of religion is to speak in terms adapted to this state. When spirit and soul are identified, God must be extroverted, must be understood as one outside and beyond, lest he likewise be identified with the individual soul. Page 85. As is well recognized, we have no knowledge of an external world, of distances between our bodies and other things, or of moving from one place to another, as anywhere but within the field of our own awareness. In other words, while we speak of knowing the external world only through impressions made on our minds and senses from outside, the very concept or sense of externality and the very existence of the sense organs are themselves known only within consciousness. This fact, once it is noticed by introspection, is utterly unavoidable, even though unfamiliar and disconcerting. We are merely unaccustomed to it through thinking of consciousness as a center located in the body, rather than a field with a central node. Page 86. The buddhi resembles a ray from the central sun of the self. Within each ray or point of view, the self projects the various objects of finite experience, and in doing so identifies itself with them. I'm skipping over now to page 87. Stripped of technicalities, all that we are saying is that the basic awareness in man, the fundamental identity and knower, is a point of view taken by that essentially infinite and omniscient consciousness, which is the ultimate reality. Consciousness in man is continuous with, and in principle identical with, the all-consciousness. Page 88. When the self is no longer identified with the ego, when, in certain spiritual practices, it penetrates and realizes its own depths, it simply knows that it is eternal and all-inclusive. Words can convey no proof, no conviction of this experience, but when realized, this knowledge is of a certainty so much greater than any other kind of knowledge that doubt seems impossible. We generally confuse the self with the memory, and the continuity of the memory with the eternal persistence of the self behind the changing flux of experience. But the consciousness of the self is strictly a now consciousness, and it seems to remember the past only because the memory traces on the psychophysical organism are present. The self can only be said to remember in the completely different sense of remembering itself, of reassuming not a past, but an eternal consciousness, of seizing, as it were, to focus itself as the buddhi upon the particular and individual point of view. The infinite can have no purpose. For being infinite, it lacks nothing. And being eternal does not live in terms of past, present, and future. Religion speaks of God as having a purpose only because it conceives him analogically in terms of time. Page 93. The poetic idea of the universe as the play or dance of God reveals the meaning of the fact that all finite beings are transitory, constantly flowing and changing, that death is essential to finite life, and that in resisting change we are resisting the very principle that makes life lively. Fundamentally, then, all joy and sorrow, all pleasure and pain, all love and anger, all enlightenment and ignorance are known by none other than the infinite self, freely and deliberately abandoning itself to and identifying itself with every finite point of view. Page 95. Eternity is not a state of void and blankness, which is all that is left when time comes to an end. To enter eternity is not to leave all the relationships and values of time in the past. The infinite and eternal includes time and space eternally, though not necessarily. I'm on page 98, and this will be the final reading for today. Finally, to ask what is the meaning of the entire process of the infinite manifesting itself as the finite, of ultimate reality playing all these innumerable parts, is to ask the meaning of love, the meaning of relationship, the very meaning of meaning.